Hello and welcome. My name is Steve and thank you for joining us. Today we are continuing a series titled Interactions, where we are looking at conversations and interactions that Jesus had with others. Today we're in the Gospel of Luke, chapter 15, as we consider the parable of the lost son. Are we outside standing and looking in judgment? Are we inside joining the party? Let's get started. This series, I didn't, again, intend just to stay in the Gospel of Luke. But Luke, as he describes in the beginning of his Gospel, sets out to write an orderly account, right? So it's actually a pretty good Gospel if you just want to track through the life and ministry of Jesus. Here's kind of an orderly account. So we've kind of just fell into Luke by accident as we've studied and talked about these interactions that Jesus has, these conversations that Jesus has with others. But I need to back up, I need to press pause for just a moment because I want us to see something. Luke chapter 9 kind of is a significant movement in the gospel. Luke 9 is kind of a major divide or a new section of the Gospel of Luke. So I want us to kind of see in the Gospel of Luke how Luke has kind of arranged this narrative into several major sections. And it's in your notes. It's also here on the slides. But we began the Gospel of Luke with a prologue. That's verses 1 through 4 of chapter 1. An introduction, if you will. And these divisions are just, they're kind of here to help us along. It's not like God said, here are the dividers that you're going to put. But we see a flow through the Gospel of Luke. Part 1, the announcement of God's kingdom, Luke chapter 3 through about Luke chapter 9. And this is also a section that Jesus begins his ministry around Galilee, the Galilean ministry. Luke 9 in verse 51 begins a major shift. And that's the shift of Jesus as he begins to travel toward Jerusalem. And this, of course, is leading up to the Passion Week and all of that. Part 3 is in Jerusalem. It's the confrontation, the execution, and the resurrection in chapters 19 through 24. So those are kind of the major themes or the major movements through Luke's gospel, if you will. And the reason why I want to bring that to our attention is because we are jumping forward, real far forward in Luke's gospel this morning as we look at Luke chapter 15 and this parable of the lost son or the prodigal son, probably one of the more familiar parables of Jesus. I think it's something that we're all acquainted with. If you want to go ahead and turn to Luke chapter 15, we're going to take a few moments to kind of consider this parable. Now, as I mentioned, there's a major shift going on here. And so we're dropping into this second section of Luke's gospel, this second major movement where Jesus is determined to go to Jerusalem. I told you to go to Luke 15. Back up with me just for a moment to Luke chapter 9 and verse 51. Luke 9 and verse 51. And this is kind of where that transition takes place. At the time, as the time approached for him, Jesus, to be taken up to heaven, notice, Jesus resolutely, NIV, set out for Jerusalem. You see that? Jesus resolutely. Or if you may have the New King James or the King James Bible, it may say, set his face toward Jerusalem. The idea here being communicated is that Jesus the time has come, and now I am going to turn my face, I am going to turn my conviction, my resolution, I am going to Jerusalem. And Jesus knows why he's going to Jerusalem, right? That's why he resolutely sets his face to head to Jerusalem. So the ministry of Jesus shifts from Galilee towards Jerusalem and the cross. And in this section, this part 2, if you will, a lot of scholars and different people have described this somewhat as like Jesus' travelogue. And we're kind of on this road trip with Jesus as he sets his face towards Jerusalem. And we're going to read about these towns and cities and villages that Jesus passes through as he goes through Jerusalem. So it's a travelogue section. Luke is recording the travels of Jesus as he sets his face towards Jerusalem. And a lot of this, we don't have time to go into all of this, but it's very interesting. What Luke is also doing is he's kind of shaping this road trip, if you will, to remind us of another road trip that the children of God took, and that is the Exodus. So as Jesus travels from Galilee down to Jerusalem, Luke is kind of overlaying this with the story of Israel from Mount Sinai to the Promised Land, the journey of Exodus. So Moses, right, led the children of Israel from Mount Sinai into the Promised Land after they had wandered in the wilderness. And then later, King David would come and establish his throne, his capital city in Jerusalem. And so what Luke is doing is he's placing Jesus into this setting, this journey from Galilee to Jerusalem. And what Luke is doing in his narrative is he's showing us how, as David gathered a people together, Jesus is gathering a people together to live under the rule, the reign, the kingdom of Christ. So in a lot of ways, Luke is overlaying Jesus' road trip with the account of Exodus. And like I said there, chapter 9 and verse 51, Jesus sets his face toward Jerusalem. And as he does so, he sends disciples ahead of him to prepare the road or to prepare the way. Look at chapter 10 real quick in verses 1 through 4. After this, the Lord appointed 72 others and sent them out 2 by 2 ahead of him to every town and place where he was about to go. And he told them, "The harvest is plentiful, but the workers are few. Ask the Lord of the harvest, therefore, to send out workers into the harvest field. Go, I'm sending you out like lambs among wolves. Do not take a purse or a bag or sandals, and do not greet anyone along the road." So kind of picture, did I miss something here? No, we're good. Okay, sorry. So kind of picture in your mind, if you will, right? Here's Jesus. I am determined to head to Jerusalem. I'm setting my face to Jerusalem. Now, he takes this wave of disciples and he sends them out 2 by 2. He says, now you go. And you go to every town and village ahead of me. And so what they do is they go out. They come, this massive wave of these disciples just flood out. And they begin to go into all the towns and the villages. And then here comes Jesus shortly after. He follows behind them. And this message of the kingdom that the disciples take out with them. Now Jesus comes in and says, now here is the kingdom. Here I am. And so what they're doing is they're kind of preparing the road, preparing the way for Jesus. And as Jesus comes in, Jesus begins to proclaim the good news of God's kingdom. He begins to proclaim the message of God and of his kingdom. So we notice here in this section that much like last week in our last lesson, Jesus much of his teaching is in the form of parables as he goes to present and share this message of the kingdom of God. And what this teaching is doing, what these parables are doing, is they're forcing the hearers, and they're forcing us to rethink how we see our world in light of the kingdom of God. They're forcing us to rethink how we consider wealth, how we consider the poor, how we consider the outcast, how we consider those who are sinful. So what Jesus is doing is he's forcing us to rethink our view and our understanding of the world in light of the kingdom of God. And this is the message that he's proclaiming as he sets his face toward Jerusalem. And in doing so, there's a tension that's just building around this journey. Because Israel's elite, the religious leaders, they're starting to take exception with what Jesus is doing, with what Jesus is saying. Why would God's prophet welcome sinners? Why would God's prophet eat with sinners? And there's a tension that begins to build along the journey as Jesus resolutely sets out to go to Jerusalem and the cross. And it's in the middle of all this journey, and in the middle of this tension, Luke chapter 15, where we read about 3 parables of things that are lost. The lost sheep, the lost coin, the lost son. And I think one of the things that we see in Luke 15 through these parables about lost things is that the kingdom of God is not exclusive. It's not for one group. It's not for one certain type. The kingdom of God is for all. And this is what at least some of the religious leaders begin to take exception with. Jesus is teaching here about the kingdom of God being for all people. So all of that, just to drop into the parable of the lost son, like I said, I don't want to just go there without understanding some of the story and some of the background as we begin to just look at this parable of the lost son or the prodigal son. It's in Luke 15. There we go. We're finally there. And the parable, the story was read for us, but it's one we're familiar with, right? We all know this parable of the lost son. There was a father who had these 2 sons, and the younger son comes to the father and says, I want everything that's mine. I want what belongs to me, and I want it right now. The father gives him his half of the inheritance, and the younger son takes off from his father's home. And he essentially spends the money, squanders everything that he has. And he finds himself in destitute situations. He finds himself unable to be employed. He finds himself unable to generate money or have a way that he can provide for himself. And then on top of this, a severe famine hits the land. And so this young man is in a very destitute situation. And he finally decides, you know what, I'm going to go take some work feeding pigs on a farm. Now, there's a little hidden detail there that we may not pick up on as, our culture, but for a Jewish man, this is a very unclean animal, a pig. We don't associate with pork, right? As Jews, that's not kosher. We don't eat that. But here's this young man. Now he's forced to go live and feed these pigs. And he's so hungry, he says, man, even what they're getting, the slop that are being fed to these pigs, at least that might fill my belly. And so this is where he's at. And as he finds himself in this place, he realizes that even the helpers in my Father's house have more than me. Now, at least they've got something to eat. and a place to sleep. So what he does is he begins to rehearse, what am I going to tell my dad? Father, I've sinned. So he begins to work out this speech that he's going to prepare for his dad, and he sets off on his journey home. Now his father has been longing to see his son, but there's a famine. And the father has probably understood chances of my son surviving were very little. I'll probably never see my son again because the famine has taken so much away from our people and from the land. But as his father is longing to see his son, from a distance he sees what he believes is his son. And he rushes and he runs, and it is his son. He runs towards him. And before the son can even begin the words of the speech, the father just grabs him, throws his arms around him, and kisses him. And showers him with gifts. Bring him the robe, bring him the ring, shoes, sandals for his feet. Slaughter the fatted calf, for my son who was dead is alive. My son who was lost is found. And so what does the dad do? The dad throws a party because his son is alive. Tell everybody, come to the party because the one that I thought had died is alive. It's time to party. It's another thing, sidetrack, rabbit trail. This section of Luke's gospel, kind of like we looked at earlier with the banquets and the dinners, there's like a dueling banquet parties going on all through here. There's this party, this dinner, and you can just go through and compare all these dinners. All right, enough of that rabbit trail. Throw a party. My son, whom I thought was dead, is alive. But the older son, he's been out in the field, he's tired, he's been working, and he's coming, walking up to the house, and there's all this music, this celebration going on. And he calls for one of the helpers, and he said, "What is going on?" "Oh, your brother has come home." But the older son is angry. He's mad. "What do you mean this loser has come home? Why are we throwing him a party? He's squandered everything. He's a disgrace to the family name. Why are we giving him a party?" And he's angry about his father throwing a party for this disgrace of a son. "You see, Dad, I've been here. I've been working for you. I've never been disobedient to you. I've always served you, and you've never given me a party at all. But this son who has gone off and wasted everything, you want to throw him a party? Why? Why are you giving a party for this son who is a disgrace to our family?" The father says, "Your brother's come home. He's alive. We've killed the fatted calf because he's home safe. He's sound." You see, the older brother sees himself as faithful to the father. The younger brother, he sees as someone who's a disgrace to the family. But what does the father tell him? "Look, son, you've always been with me, and everything that I have is yours. You've always been here, and all of mine is yours. But your brother, oh, he was dead. He's come home. He was dead, but now he's alive. He was lost, and now he's found. So as we think about this parable, what does Jesus want these religious elites to understand as the tension builds? What does he want them to see as he shares this parable? He wants them to see the outsiders, the outcasts. He wants them to see the suffering because God does. God sees them. And here's what Jesus is doing as he sets his face to Jerusalem. He's coming to reclaim all the sons and all the daughters of God Most High. And he's coming to reclaim them to his kingdom. And he's coming to say to those who have been dead, you are now alive. And the religious elite can't see it. God's kingdom, Jesus is saying, is for everyone. And whoever comes humbly to me is welcomed and delivered. And we are celebrating all who come. You see, rejecting this message is not just a rejection of Jesus, but it's also a rejection of what God has been doing through Jesus as he leads a new exodus to the promised land. And the road trip to Jerusalem is the final journey. And as Jesus sets out on this journey, the tension is building. And he resolutely sets his face to Jerusalem because Jesus knows what must be accomplished to bring about God's restoration of all things. So Luke, from here, is going to launch into part 3, Jerusalem, confrontation, execution, and resurrection. And that's where we're going to go next week in the story as we continue to follow Jesus and his interactions in the Passover plot as that develops. But Luke is sharing this story of Jesus. Just as each of the gospel authors do, they're sharing the story of Jesus as they unfold the plan and purposes of God in his kingdom. How God is working in his world through his son, Jesus. And what they're doing is yes, they are revealing the identity of Jesus, but as they do so, they're also revealing to us God's purpose and restoration and redemption and reclaiming what was dead or what was lost, as God has been reclaiming his creation through Jesus. Some are going to be blinded to what God is doing. Some are going to let prejudice, they're going to let jealousies, they're going to let doubts, even exclusive attitudes prevent them from seeing and from experiencing the good news of God through Messiah Jesus. See, what Jesus is doing is he's forming a new community. A new community formed in him. And it's a new way of seeing others. It's a new way of seeing and experiencing our world. It's a new way of envisioning God's purposes and his mission in our world. So as we think about what Jesus is doing and the message of the kingdom of God, just a simple question for us this morning. Are we standing outside of the party, looking in, judging others? Or are we coming to the party and celebrating with Jesus in the new kingdom, in his new community?